Welcome to Voices of Esalen. I'm Sam Stern. Today, my guest is Jeff Kripal, professor of philosophy and religious thought at Rice University. He is also the chairman of the board of the Esalen Institute. Jeff's work is far-ranging and touches upon, among many subjects, the study of comparative erotics and ethics in mystical literature. He is the author of a host of books, including Colley's Child and Supernatural, A New Vision of the Unexplained. But today I spoke with him about his book, Esalen, America and the Religion of No Religions, which I consider a must-read for anyone interested in examining the various cultural and historical forces at play during the origins of the Esalen Institute. Jeff is an amazingly original thinker and such a powerful resource. He is also very honest, very candid. This is a good man, a cool dude. I hope that you'll enjoy our rambling discussion. Here's Jeff Kripal. Jeff Kripal, thank you so much for joining us on Voices of Esalen.
Yeah, I'm happy to be here.
I recently dug into your work, Esalen, America and the Religion of No Religions, and it was fantastic read and a very useful overview for me to understand the fabric that defines Esalen.
Right. Well, thanks. I always wonder who reads it. It's either a good book or a doorstop, so it's nice to know it was a good book for you.
Would you say that, is it fair to say that you're one of the foremost scholars of Esalen history?
Well, that's for other people to say. There's really only been 3 books that I know of written on Esalen now. And when I wrote that one, there was just one, Walt Anderson's Upstart Spring, which is a great book, actually. But it ends in about 1980. And so when I started my own book, it was about 2000, 2001. So, there was over 2 decades there. And, of course, I had a different approach than Walt did. So that's why I wrote the book for a number of reasons. But it's certainly one of 3 books on Esalen, I'll put it that way.
Well, let's dive in a little bit about what was it that drew you to Esalen that made you want to write kind of a comprehensive intellectual and sociocultural history of it?
Okay, well, that's a professional and a deeply personal question, but I'm happy to answer both of them. That's most things at Esalen are. So I was trained as a historian of religions, which most people would just translate as comparative religion. I was trained at the University of Chicago, and I was trained particularly to compare Asian religions and Western religions. Roman Catholicism and Hinduism happened to be my 2 areas of interest. I came out of a Catholic monastic context, actually. I wanted to be a monk. I was a seminarian at a Benedictine monastery, and I went to graduate school and became essentially a comparativist and ended up writing a dissertation on the great Hindu saint Ramakrishna, 19th century Hindu saint, who was extremely influential here in the 60s and 70s through a book called The Gospel of Sri Ramakrishna. And I learned Bengali, which is what the text is written in. I lived in Calcutta for a school year, and I wrote this dissertation, which became my first book, called Colley's Child. And essentially what Colley's Child did is it tracked the English translation of the Gospel of Sri Ramakrishna and showed how it had left a whole bunch of stuff out that was in the Bengali. And the stuff it left out, or the stuff it spun, was the tantric stuff, some of which was very sexual, very graphic. And so I wrote about all of that, and it came out in 1995. So that was my dissertation and first book, and it became a kind of instant hit, as it were, in academic circles, but it also attracted the almost immediate attention of the Hindu religious right, which had just come into power in India. They attempted to ban it, essentially. There were 2 national ban movements against the book in India, one in 97 and one in 2000, 2001 when I was teaching at Harvard. Both of those ban movements technically failed, went all the way up to Parliament, where it was voted down, but they practically succeeded. They essentially turned me into a kind of Salman Rushdie figure. and I became this sort of demonic, evil Western colonialist. And really, if you read the book, it's actually very affectionate. I love Ramakrishna. It's a affectionate book, but they just didn't want anybody talking about sexuality and sainthood at all. And there was a strong homoerotic current through the materials I was working with. And I was working with those as scholars work with them, very descriptively, very appreciatively, no moral judgment whatsoever. In fact, a lot of the Catholic streams I had come from were similarly homoerotic. So it was very familiar to me. And so I just wrote about it for about 7 years, from about 97 to about 04 or so. I was the target of all of these, not just banned movements, but all of these internet hate campaigns, particularly coming out of Silicon Valley with sort of right-wing Hindu computer scientists who knew way more about the internet than I did and really came after me hard and really ruined my name, essentially, in the Indian communities here. So the reason I'm telling you this story is in the middle of this horrible, horrible experience, 6-7 years of this. It was, to tell you how bad it got, when I moved to Harvard in 2000, they, of course, saw that and ramped up all the hate campaigns because I was at Harvard. And then when I moved to Rice in 2002, they attempted to block my hire and then block my tenure. So this was really serious stuff. It was really scary. It was really awful. And in the middle of that horrible experience of being the object of other people's hate campaigns, Mike read the book, Mike Murphy. He was in a San Rafael restaurant. It was the spring or early summer of 98. He just loved the book, like a lot of people. If you read the book, it's a good book. And he particularly loved it because it was about this tantric tradition that Sri Aurobindo also participated in. And so he recognized all of the tantric currents that I was writing about. Sri Aurobindo was a Bengali like Ramakrishna, but lived in a later period. He died toward the middle of the last century. Ramakrishna died in 1886, I believe, was when he died. So anyway, Mike finished the book in this restaurant and was so excited he called, he had a cell phone in the 98, and he called an operator and somehow found my name, and he forgot about the 3-hour time difference. So it was like close to midnight when the phone rang, and I didn't answer it. My wife answered it, and she, of course, didn't know who Michael Murphy was. I actually recognized his name. I knew who he was because of what I do. And he was very excited, but then he was very embarrassed because he realized that it was almost midnight. And we just had a very brief, simple conversation, but he then sent me all of his books and invited me out here in November of 98. I remember it well because it was just after the baths had collapsed. The original baths were destroyed, and the baths were then up on that cliff up near Rolfe. You can see the old ones. That's where they were. And so it was November of 98. And I kept coming back. Mike kept inviting me back for CTR events. CTR had just been officially formed. And I realized at some point, and this is where it gets personal, that I could never go back to India. And that I really had to leave the study of Hinduism, which was extremely difficult. It took me years to get to that place because I had studied Indian languages for, 15 years, and I was basically deciding to just walk away from all of that. And I realized that no one had written a book about Esalen or this zone for 20, 25 years, and that I could use all of my training as a scholar of Asian religions, and I could study and write about Esalen the way I had written about Ramakrishna. And I was pretty sure no one was going to persecute me for wanting to write about the things I wanted to write about here. And so that's actually why I wrote the book. I actually wrote the book to survive intellectually and spiritually. It was not just another academic project. It was a way to redefine myself and stay alive intellectually and spiritually.
Well, I'm assuming that there was something about the Esalen Institute as you experienced it that signified a kind of path of rebirth, or a path that there was something special about it.
Well, I mean, yeah, that's an understatement. It's for those of us who either live here or are who come here a lot, it's easy to forget, that first visit and what an impact it can make on somebody, the land and the community, and just the power of the place as a kind of pilgrimage spot. But on top of all that sort of just being awed by all of that, there was an immediate kind of intellectual and spiritual hit for me, because I recognized instantly that there was this sort of tantric lineage, through Mike at least, into the place. And I recognized that was just part of the lineage. There was a lot more going on. But at least I had a way to sort of tap into one stream of this river that was flowing. And so it gave me a kind of existential connection to the place that I might not have otherwise had.
I want to talk to you a little bit about, because you're a historian, what was going on culturally during the early 1960s and perhaps a little bit before that made it possible for a place like Esalen to be founded. I thought maybe we could start off by taking a look at what was going on in the field of psychology.
Yeah, I mean, the kinds of streams that flowed into Esalen were not new. They had been flowing through American culture for a long time. Most historians would point back to mid-19th century Boston as kind of an effective origin point. So transcendentalism, Emerson, the focus on nature, the focus on Asian religion, Walt Whitman, these sorts of ecstatic, kind of natural, mystical currents that were extremely progressive and extremely provocative in the middle of the 19th century. Esalen sort of picks up on a lot of that, but adds the very important piece of modern psychology and modern science. This was a point in time in American culture where there was a kind of euphoric interest in psychology as a kind of science of the mind or the soul that was going to refigure everything. We could now figure out what religion has always been about, what art has always been about. It was a kind of master key. It all went back to the psyche, whatever that is or whatever that was. But it promised this. And there were still great sort of iconic figures in place, people like Freud and Carl Jung, and right on the horizon, Abe Maslow, who was trying to create a new psychology that was based on what he called self-actualization and peak experiences. Freud's psychology was dominant at this point. Psychoanalysis was dominant. But it had very much wedded itself to a kind of materialism, deep materialism, and a kind of sense that religion was childish and fantasy. And of course, there's a lot of evidence for that. But American psychoanalysis in the 1950s would have not been friendly at all to what was going this place at all. Jungian psychology is another matter. The Jungians would have been. They weren't particularly influential here, but that was sort of the wing that would have been. But it was really humanistic psychology and Maslow, and then Pearls, and then Gestalt, and then Groff, who sort of combines Freudian and Jungian currents that really take off here in the 60s and 70s. So it's a really complex. And I think the reason psychology was so exciting to people is it combined science and spirit, or at least that was the intuition. It wasn't just science. It was science trying to look at spirit or psyche or soul. Or if you want to be secular or reductive about it, mind or cognition. And there were very reductive models, like B.F. Skinner, for example. But those are not the people that became dominant here.
Was it coincidence, or was it a plan that a leader like Fritz Perls and his Gestalt technique became kind of the overarching dominant model here at Esalen?
I mean, a historian couldn't answer that. That's not a historical question. But it's a good question. Pearls comes a little later, and Pearls is not well received early on. He's a controversial figure. He's a difficult figure. He's at the end of his life, so he's suffering probably, and he's a bit grumpy. But he's also extremely charismatic and extremely insightful.
You write in your book about Fritz Perls, his whole life having kind of a chip on his shoulder to Freudianism.
Yes, he had a difficult relationship to the psychoanalytic community. So he was very much, he drew from Freud, but was also very much poised against Freud. But I think the bottom line with Perls is he had an almost uncanny ability to read people very, very quickly. And he had a very dramatic technique, this hot seat in a group. So there was a kind of performance quality to this. This wasn't an analyst and an analysand in a private office on a couch that nobody else participated in. This was a stage performance in some sense. And so I think that's one of the many reasons it just was really effective here, because it was really a community that was doing the therapy, not just an individual and an expert, as it were.
Yeah, I thought about that element a lot as I read your book, and it seems there's an element of drama. There's an element of wanting to take what had been in the dark, bring it out to light in some fashion that's almost acrobatic. I'm wondering if you could give some perspective on that, because that's not exactly the way that things are now.
Yeah, so I was born in 1962. So when I speak about these things, I'm speaking as a historian, not as someone who was there. However, when I was in college or the seminary in the 1970s, they were very much doing all this encounter group stuff. So I experienced it. I know what it's like, and I know sort of what the history of it is. And essentially the history is this. In the 50s, the 60s happened because of the 50s. The 50s were a kind of lockdown on the emotions. You didn't express your emotions. You had cultural movements like McCarthyism, going after intellectuals and screenwriters and people interested in these ideas. You had a war going on. You had a nuclear armament, being built up. You had, even when I was a kid, you had bomb raid things where you got under your desk and covered your head as if that was going to protect you from being vaporized by a nuclear bomb. It was ridiculous looking back on it. But it was, what I'm trying to say, it was an era of fear and an era of fantastic conservatism, and clamp down. And so the 60s was this, the reason I think in many ways it was so powerful is it was so cathartic, and expressing one's emotions and exploring one's emotions and exploring one's relationships in a public setting was just so not what was done. And so it was very powerful. When you cross a taboo, it's powerful. And I think that was a lot of the excitement. And then what happens, of course, also is then you mix in the whole psychedelic stew into that, and you just get this rocket that takes off and often crashes. But there's all kinds of things going on there. The psychedelic story is a long one, and I'm not an expert on it, but I had to interact with it a lot to write this book. And what's so interesting about the psychedelic story is that it's really a story about intellectuals and scientists. You don't get the psychedelic movement without pharmaceutical companies and professional intellectuals in universities and hospitals. What essentially happens is human beings, of course, have been using psychoactive plants for forever, but certainly not in the U.S. And Albert Hofmann synthesizes this incredibly powerful substance, looking, for a pharmaceutical. He wasn't looking for it. And he accidentally doses himself, and he has this famous bicycle ride. But then what happens is Freudians and doctors and psychoanalysts decide that it might be useful to give this new substance to medical students so that they can see what a psychosis is like from the inside. That was the reasoning, actually. And then when the Americans got a hold of it, they gave it to hospitals at universities, and they funded all kinds of studies to figure out whether it could be used for medical reasons or military reasons or whatever. And basically what happened was the intellectuals and the scientists got a hold of this stuff, and they figured out really quickly that it was extremely powerful, and they started to use it on themselves.
Recreationally.
Or to create. Like Huxley, for example. Aldous Huxley always argued against recreational use of LSD or mescaline. He was the counter voice. He did not like Tim Leary's approach to this. He knew Leary they were friends, but he completely disagreed with Leary on this one. He felt they were too powerful, and they could be used to create art or literature or thought itself. You could do things with it, but you had to use it in a controlled setting, and you had to know what you were doing, and you had to control the stuff. You couldn't release it into the public because there would be an immediate backlash. He feared a legal political backlash, which of course is exactly what happened. Leary felt that it was too good, it was too powerful, it had to be given to the people, as it were, and so release it into the bloodstream, as it were, of the culture. And this is the Ken Casey position, of course, too. And so you had this debate going on with these folks, but what's so interesting to me as a historian is it gets released into the bloodstream of the culture through the intellectuals and the scientists. It doesn't just appear. And even someone like Gordon Wasson, who was so influential in the 50s with this, he's a banker. These aren't the people you expect to invent the psychedelic culture, essentially. But that's who did it, actually. And then what happens is people like Leary and Huxley, they almost immediately associate the psychedelic states with Asian religions. And so you have this really interesting, what I call psychedelic Orientalism, that gets created in the 60s. In other words, you start to read the Hindu and Buddhist texts through the psychedelic states, and you're reading the psychedelic states through the Hindu and Buddhist texts, and they sort of generate one another in the 60s.
Where does Esalen come in? Is psychedelics already very much a figure in the national consciousness when it comes into Esalen's field, or is it sort of Esalen a disseminator?
No, Esalen inherits that. The very first workshops are on things like drug-induced mysticism, I think was the phrase in one of the very first brochures. And you have to remember, at this time, it was totally legal. So the crisis was not a legal one. It was a theological crisis. And by that I mean what was being debated at Esalen and in other places, like with Huxley and a British scholar named R.C. Zahner, what they were really debating was, can you really experience God by ingesting a mushroom or much less a man-made chemical substance? That just seemed outrageous to the kind of traditional religious heritages that had been passed on. But it looked like you could, and you may well can. So it created this sort of theological crisis, and that's what they were debating in the early 60s. They were not debating, is it legal or not, or what should we, they were debating, is this God? And if this is God, what does that mean?
I'm assuming that the climate at Esalen in regards to psychedelics probably changed quite a bit from its inception, 1961-62, to the period where America is really getting a full kind of exposure to psychedelics with 67, 68.
And then, of course, it becomes very legally dangerous in the 70s and the 80s, and Esalen has to respond in very different ways then. The legal context changes dramatically in the late 60s and early 70s.
Well, there's a passage in your book with Michael Murphy realizing that Esalen was being investigated by the Food and Drug Administration.
Yeah. Yeah, Mike took a very proactive approach to this. And I suspect if he didn't, there wouldn't be an Esalen right now. Because, of course, drug use was prominent. And there were a lot of busts going on. And Mike and Dick both feared these legal actions. And so Mike just went right to the FDA and basically said, what do we do? How do we stay open, essentially? And they basically invoked the Constitution and said, well, there's this constitutional right for hotel or I guess innkeepers in constitutional language, that the government cannot bust into an inn and yank out people staying at your inn. I mean, it was originally probably designed against the British, who were doing that. And so when the framers of the Constitution wrote the Constitution, they wanted to protect innkeepers against this kind of basically invasion. And the basic law is an innkeeper is not responsible for what goes on in the rooms of the inn. He or she is responsible for what goes on in public spaces of the inn. And so that became the distinction. You don't break into people's rooms. You don't tell people what to do or what not to do in their rooms, but you don't allow public programs that use these substances, and you don't host public events that such substances are encouraged or used openly, because then you're wide open to legal action. So that was the distinction, and it seemed to work.
Let's talk a little bit about the intellectual and literary currents that were happening during the early 1960s and mid-1960s during Esalen's early days. I guess I wanted to float the Beat generation towards you and see what you had to say.
Well, George Leonard used to say that, when all is said and done, the human potential movement, they'll look back and see it as a literary movement, primarily. That's an exaggeration, but there's a lot of truth to it.
What does it mean?
Well, it means that the people who really founded the human potential movement were writers. They were first and foremost writers. And even the therapists and the early body workers, they all wrote, and these are how these ideas were disseminated. There's no internet, right? People read books. They actually read books, and this is how you got your ideas out there. The folks who really shape the ideas that become the human potential movement are people like, the Beat poets were, of course, a collection of poets that had turned primarily to Buddhism for inspiration. And they had, there were many of them, and they were all very different, but they had sort of taken on Alan Watts as their kind of resident guru. And Watts was a fascinating, brilliant speaker and writer, and had a genius for expressing Buddhist and Taoist ideas in a kind of English humor and elegance that was extremely convincing and very attractive to these people. And so you get this fusion of American poets and Buddhism through that. And some of these Beat poets, people like Ginsberg, for example, had profound mystical experiences reading poetry and then converted to Buddhism. They were also proposing or propounding basic Hindu practices, but they were also getting into huge legal trouble because the pornography or the laws around how you could express sexuality in literature hadn't been fought out yet. And so someone like Henry Miller down the road here, he used to joke if you wanted to buy his books, you had to go to where the shipments come in because they'd all been confiscated and they were all in these warehouses. So he was just banned all over the place. And Ginsberg was like that. Howl was his great poem. And censorship campaigns against it were extreme. But those battles were fought and won. And so that's another thing that produces the 60s is you can now express yourself in a way around sexuality that you actually would have been jailed before that. And we don't realize that, with the internet and everything. We're kind of spoiled here. But I mean, you could be jailed. There were postal laws. If you sent literature through the mail on things like birth control or something, you could be jailed for that because you were distributing pornographic materials.
What I'm trying to get at here was Esalen kind of a product of the 60s, or was it something that was going to come into existence no matter what, and just profoundly influenced by the cultural developments that were happening?
It's a great question. When I wrote the book in 2007, and a Houston family gave the press a little chunk of money and sent me on a book tour, and so I went all up and down this coast and through the Midwest and just a little out east. By the way, if you want to be humbled, go on a book tour. It's extremely humbling. But, the couple dozen people I spoke to, the question they always asked, this is 2007 now, so this is in the middle of the Bush years. The question they always asked was, how do we do this again? How do we get this thing going again? In other words, not just Esalen, but the whole thing. And my answer, which wasn't much of an answer, but it's all I got, was that it's not up to you, actually. An idea is an idea that's waiting for the right cultural or social moment. And what you have to understand about early Esalen is that none of the ideas were new. The ideas had been floating in the culture and in these writers' lives for sometimes decades, but nobody was listening. And in the early 60s, you then have this youth culture that suddenly is listening. And so the youth culture embraces these older intellectuals and these older writers and takes their ideas and runs with them. And so now the writers have a youth culture and the youth culture have a writer, and it's this magical alchemy that creates this movement. There was a kind of serendipity here. There was a kind of massive synchronicity between what Mike and Dick wanted to do and what the culture was ready for. And I think that's why you get that. So to answer your question, Esalen certainly did not produce the counterculture by any stretch of the imagination, but it happened to get going right as that was happening. Counterculture is a little later, 64, somewhere in there. And then they become synergistic, but one didn't produce the other.
When you say the counterculture is a little bit later, are you talking about the civil rights and anti-war?
Yeah, 62, things aren't really revving up. It's later. Martin Luther King and the Kennedy assassination. Of course, Vietnam War is a huge issue here. That comes later. And a lot of the psychedelic and the music culture, that explodes as well a little later. So you're just getting going as an institution, and then this cultural thing explodes. We're just down the road, actually, right? In the Bay Area and Monterey. So it's not only well timed, it's well placed.
Was there a sense that Esalen was somewhat isolationist? I mean, it is here in Big Sur. It's San Francisco is just down the road, but it's a long, windy, treacherous road. Because I've never really heard about how the anti-war movement landed here at Esalen.
The anti-war movement, in my historical reading, is much more located in Berkeley. The interests here were much more sort of east-west, sort of philosophical, body work. Early on, it wasn't political activism like you're talking about. Personal activism. Yes, it was. Later, the political activism comes in particularly the Russian-American projects that start in the 70s. But again, that's a little later. Let me say one more thing there, Sam. Mike talks a lot about the outlaw country. And when the place was started, like sheriffs would barely come up here or down here, whatever metaphor you want to use. And I think that isolation served it well. You come to the outlaw country, so to speak, to do things that are not maybe illegal, but are outside the cultural norms. It gives you a space to transcend your own culture, as it were, which these things would be hard to do in, say, Kansas in 1962. John Hyder, a longtime resident, wrote actually a wonderful novel called I think it was Living in Paradox, that's what it's called. Never published. But basically what John did is that he imagined what Esalen would be like if it was founded in Kansas. And he's a very funny man. And of course it wouldn't work. So...
It's funny that you bring up John Hyder, because I had a quote here that I was going to bring up. In September 1967, Esalen seemed a paradise of permission, opportunity, beauty, and truth. By February 1971, both I and the Institute seemed older and weary, jaded by too many miracles too quickly digested.
It had been going 9 years then, and like a lot of utopian or charismatic communities, you expect utopia, and then when it doesn't happen, then you got to kind of regroup, as it were.
Well, this is endemic of the hippie movement.
Yeah.
As a whole.
By 71, there were serious holes and crises in the hippie movement. I mean, the Manson murders are often pointed to as the sort of the end of the counterculture. I think that's, again, an exaggeration, but there's something to that. It was deeply symbolic.
Well, let's back up just a second. It took us to 71 before getting to the... What happens when Esalen finally is kind of taken out of its isolationist beauty and people start writing about it?
Well, it depends on who writes what, of course. I mean, there were hundreds, if not thousands, of media pieces on Esalen, and there were a few very, very good ones. But it really becomes famous. I mean, it becomes maybe not like Haight-Ashbury or Berkeley, but it becomes one of the nodes of this counterculture, and it's where you want to go if you're your age, as opposed to my age at the moment. So George Harrison lands here with Maharishi Mahesh Yogi on the front lawn in a helicopter. I mean, you don't. So it's got cultural cachet at that point.
There's an interesting description in your book, I believe it's in your book and not the Upstart Spring, which describes Hollywood actresses and actors coming here, and Natalie Wood taking part in some sort of encounter group.
I think that story, it's been a while since I read that, but I think that was actually a party in Hollywood that Esalen figures were invited to. Okay. And I think Fritz Perls was the show there, spanking Natalie Wood on some Gestalt session. I know George Leonard was there, and I think Mike was there too, but yeah, I think that's the Hollywood party.
Okay. There's another passage in your book which describes Fritz Perls smacking Carlos Castaneda?
Right.
What was the occasion?
Well, okay, so Perls he referred to Mike's interest in mysticism as the mud of occultism, which is actually how Freud, he got it from Freud. That's what he said. He got that from Freud, who was talking about Jung. But anyway, Perls was extremely skeptical of all of these ideas about the mystical and the occult and the metaphysical. And there was all the things Mike was interested in. And when he heard Carlos Castaneda, who was just an anthropology, he was another academic, by the way. He was an anthropology student. And this was before he had published the book. And that was 1968 or so when the first Carlos Castaneda book came out. And this was much before that. And he was telling these stories about meeting this shaman. And Perls didn't believe any of it. He just thought he was lying. And so he slapped him. That's a typical Fritz Perls story. Those currents have been very strong here, the mystical currents. But there have often been a lot of counter voices to that and a kind of insistence on just the material world or just the body or opening up or down into the body but refusing or resisting anything outside it.
Now that you speak of the body, how radical was it for Esalen to be a center of somatic exploration, including the notorious baths or massage therapy with nude practitioners?
If you didn't express your emotions in the 50s, you sure in the hell didn't get naked and sit in hot water with other people, right? And you certainly didn't let anybody touch you to whom you were not married. That's radical stuff. And the ideas that were floating around here, still float around here, do more than float. It wasn't just a matter of touching or massage or the baths. It was that there's something deeply mysterious and wonderful about the body, that the body stores emotion and memory and wisdom in a way that we haven't really accessed because we're so removed from it. And there were also really powerful, this is where the Freudian streams were so important here, not through Freud, but through Reich, Wilhelm Reich and his disciples, who really saw this orgone, this libidinal, sexual, cosmic energy in the body as the secret of all health and happiness. And for Reich, at least, orgone was literal. It wasn't a metaphor. There really was orgone in the stars, in the trees, in our bodies, and it manifested most powerfully in our sexualities and our emotional life. And the whole point of Reichian body work or Reichian therapy was to get it flowing, to remove the blocks, or what he called the body armor. That's heretical, even with respect to psychoanalysis. You've got a series of heresies going on here that land in some of their most extreme forms here at Esalen, and then they become kind of the norm. So I think somatics at Esalen is really there's a lot of streams coming into it as well that are often very, very rich and very, very complicated.
Was there a point at which it became less edgy, or what exactly happened as it evolved?
Well, so a number of things happened. First of all, the baby boomers grew up. It's one thing to be edgy at 24. It's another thing to be edgy at 34 or 44, right? You need a job, you have children, and you have to figure out, how do we raise the children, and so your values begin to change. And the culture that you originally were countering or resisting, you now have to become a part of to effectively raise the children. Mm-hmm. So I think that's happening in the 70s and 80s. I also think some of the promises are wearing thin. Some of the quick promises of utopia on Earth. The psychedelic stuff, the crashes as well as the flights are now obvious to people. There's a lot of, they're victims as well as heroes of that now. So people are starting to see that. The drug war, not yet called the drug war, is starting. These things are illegal, or a lot of them are illegal. There are suicides, on campus. There are people who are killing themselves. Not a lot, but just enough that it's disturbing. So there are challenges, and the culture itself is changing. As you move from the 60s into the 70s, which is when I came into early adulthood, the values are changing. Disco is not Jimi Hendrix. And certainly by the time you get to the 80s, you get this kind of, this is me now, this is kind of a grotesque materialism kicks in. Mm-hmm. And you get the AIDS crisis where countless people are dying of some disease we don't understand. And so the sexual revolution in the 80s becomes deeply suspect. And so, and Esalen's having to settle down and trying to figure out how to survive long term. The other thing you have to understand is that early Esalen had almost no employees, and operated on a shoestring, and little or few legal concerns or insurance concerns or health care. I mean, on and on and on. The early photos, 5 employees? And God only knows what they were getting paid, probably almost nothing. And so, by the 80s and 90s, the staff and the administration are growing because they have to. The income has to increase. And, it's the nature of any institution that is going to mature. If it's going to survive, it has to develop the structures that allow institutions to survive in a particular culture.
I'm curious how it evolved intellectually, because it seemed like there was great food for thought during the 60s as the world of psychology becomes more geared towards humanistic psychology, and obviously the East meets West.
I think the interests and the interests grow and shift and change. I think in the 70s, those are no longer as hot. In the 70s, you've got Stan Grof living here, and you've got a whole Grofian world developing. But you also have the beginning and really explosion of citizen diplomacy and American-Russian projects, originally all around parapsychology, more or less, but then they develop into citizen diplomacy during really the nadir of the Cold War, which I remember intensely. I mean, we were looking at nuclear holocaust with thousands or tens of thousands of nuclear missiles just taking out the entire northern hemisphere. That's really what we were looking at. So they were trying to address that, and then on the ground here, also the physics of consciousness became very big with Fritjof Capra and later a whole bevy of what David Kaiser has called hippie physicists who were meeting here and really exploring a lot of really interesting ideas around physics and consciousness. So it takes off in different ways. Yes. That's all in the 70s, by the way. Okay. So Grof, I mean, he starts out in Czechoslovakia as a classical Freudian psychoanalyst. And by that I mean totally reductive, complete materialist. And he was one of the young medical students to whom they gave LSD to try to imitate a psychosis. And the way Stan tells the story, instead of psychosis, he sees God, basically, and it just flips his world, just flips him. And he becomes fascinated in LSD research, and he's really the lead researcher there in the 60s. And then the communists roll in to Czechoslovakia and basically take over the country, and Stan decides to stay in the U.S. at that point as a political exile. And he meets Mike at some event out east. He was at Johns Hopkins, I believe is where he was. And Mike invites him out here, and he comes out 70, 71, somewhere in there. And he ends up staying for 14 years. And so he becomes a real part of the community and a part of the whole intellectual atmosphere. And, he's interested in, of course, LSD and psychedelics, but they're now illegal. And so he has to develop some other way of getting people into altered states. And he develops this holotropic breath work, as a response to the legal situation, I think. But it ends up working as well, and he takes off and does that, still doing that, to this day. We do that. I mean, my best friends in Houston are part of that holotropic breathwork community. So it's pretty much everywhere now. But what's interesting, when I wrote the book, there's a whole chapter just on Stan Grof in it, because I was so fascinated with his material. What I find so interesting about Grof is, if you know something about the history of psychology, what you recognize reading Stan is that he's very, very Freudian, but he's also very, very Jungian, which you rarely see. You usually see people who are just Freudian or just Jungian, but you don't see someone who's integrating them the way. And he's Freudian in the sense that, he believes and has written that a lot of LSD trips and holotropic trips are about reliving the birth canal, and the traumas of birth and all of these perinatal matrices that we allegedly go through. That's so Freudian, that's so Freudian. It's sort of more Freud than Freud was, because it's taking it back in, before birth. But then, all of his stuff on a kind of mind at large and a kind of archetypal way of looking at these things, very Jungian, very non-reductive, very interested in mystical states and what happens to us when we die and all of that. So I was really fascinated by Grof's work. And he was a big part. big part of Esalen in the 70s. He 70, 71 to about 84, somewhere in there.
Well, good. Thank you so much, Jeff Kripal. Thanks for your foundational work, Esalen, America, and the Religion of No Religions. I really appreciated speaking with you about the history and the fabric that kind of underwrites this amazing institution.
I'm just thrilled you read the book, Sam. Thanks. Thanks for reading me. All right.
Thank you for listening to Voices of Esalen. Today's episode was produced in conjunction with Cheryl Franzel, Geraldine Hess, Lori Putnam, Shannon Hudson, and Ian Golden. You can find us on iTunes or at the Esalen website. That's esalen.org. Today's music is by Christian Bjorklund. The track is Hallen. That's it. Until next time, be well.